Hello, this talk is entitled The Spanish Flu in Hull. This talk stemmed from an article that I wrote in 2017. At that time, unsurprisingly, only the Banyan, the East Yorkshire Family History Society's magazine, took it. The article was finally printed in May of this year, in the wake of the COVID-19 developments. The word pandemic, uninteresting in 2017, is strangely popular right now. The pandemic of a century ago was significantly more serious than our present crisis. In the years of 1918 and 1919, probably just outside of living memory, the entire world suffered one of the greatest disasters ever to befall it. And yet, at least in 2017, it was almost completely forgotten. Here's a photograph of my grandparents' wedding, taken on the 24th of December 1918, at the height of the pandemic. Everyone photographed here survived it. Indeed, I have no knowledge if any of them caught it. I was told of some of the exploits in the First World War, yet of the Spanish flu and their experiences, no family tale has emerged. Was it too terrible to discuss? Or was my family one of the lucky ones? Impossible questions to answer now. In lieu of that, during this talk, I will try to tell the story of the Spanish flu. Firstly, by looking at the pandemic as a whole and how it began, and how it affected the whole world. Secondly, the talk will look at how it affected Hull in particular. This information will be drawn mainly from the way it was reported in the press at the time. Considering that the Spanish flu was so forgotten by our modern world, it is surprising that it permeated the popular culture of the time at many levels. The slide shows the sheet music to Influenza Blues, written and performed in 1919. It can still be heard on YouTube if you so desire. The final verse is on the right-hand side of the slide, and as one can see, it's not a cheery ditty. The American writer Catherine Ann Porter wrote of her experience of the flu in New Orleans when she almost died from it. The short story, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, won a Pulitzer Prize. Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos and William Carlos Williams were all affected in some way by the pandemic, but did not use it in their fiction. A pity. More mundanely, my mother taught me a short rhyme for use with a skipping rope. She was born in 1921, so missed the pandemic, but she told me she'd been taught it by her elder sisters, who had lived through it. And it went like this. I had a little bird, its name was Ensa. I opened up the window, an influenza. So, where does the Spanish flu fit in the all-time killer pandemics of history's Golden Globe Awards? Drum roll, please. Yes, second behind the Black Death, which is estimated to have killed between 1/3 and half of the world's population. However, as you can see, 3 of the 4 outbreaks on the list are historically remote, and therefore the number of deaths are conjecture and dubious. The Spanish flu is the only one from recent times. As such, the figures are reasonably reliable, although estimates of the death toll are continually being rounded upwards on the back of further research. Influenza is a new disease to us humans. Well, new in this case means that we have recently acquired it as a species. As such, it's called a zoonose. Humans have their own diseases that have accompanied us since our tree-dwelling days. These are known as heritage diseases, and we have had millennia to adapt to them and minimise their effects upon us. Zoonoses are an altogether different proposition. Zoonoses and us, the human species, have not had such a long acquaintance. Therefore, they can be deadly to us. It is thought that we acquired influenza from our proximity to animals via our domestication of them. Influenza is a heritage disease of pigs, fowl, and horses. Domestication, especially of the pig, probably led to it jumping species for the first time about 7,000 years ago, when we began to be farmers and not hunters. Influenza also has the distinctly unfriendly habit of mutating rapidly, so rapidly in fact there was no cure. Now pigs, fowl, etc. have had this disease so much longer than we, and therefore can deal with it so much better than us. Give us another 100,000 years, and the flu will be a mild irritant. Not now though, and definitely not in 1918. Influenza is a crowd disease. It can only survive in a crowd, as it needs its victims to transmit the virus to other victims. The previous slide showed the transmission in action. We have had influenza epidemics in the past. The first mention of such a one was in Europe in 1387, and the word influenza itself was first coined in Italian in 1743. The 19th century saw a number of severe outbreaks that spread across Europe. The year 1833 was a particularly bad one, closely following the outbreak of cholera for the first time in Europe in 1832. An outbreak of influenza known as Russian flu struck in the winter of 1892-3, and Hull, being a large trading port with Russia and the Baltic, suffered very badly. This slide shows in detail someone with Spanish flu who was close to death. Heliotrope cyanosis was the term. This refers to the point when the lungs become clogged with fluid, sometimes blood, and the heart cannot get oxygen from the lungs to pump around the body. Often, in autopsy, the heart was found to be 3 or 4 times its normal size due to its efforts to continue pumping. Lungs could be wrung out like towels. The slide shows the telltale signs of lack of oxygen, the blueness of the lips and ears, and the pallor of the face. When a patient reached this stage, the medical staff knew they could do no more for the patient. Another factor that was so unusual about the Spanish flu was that, although people from all ages could be targeted, many of the victims of this pandemic were the young and healthy. As we all know, with the normal influenza, it's the very old and the very young who succumb. The Spanish flu turned this truism on its head. Why? It's only recently that a possible solution to this has been accepted. The theory is that the victim's body itself assists the flu in that an autoimmune reaction to contracting the flu takes place, which was especially rapid in the healthy and young. This autoimmune reaction filled the lungs with fluid too quickly for the patient to deal with, and thus suffocating them from within. The autoimmune reaction in the aged and the other usual victims of the flu wasn't so dynamic, giving them times to deal with this fluid buildup. The Spanish flu affected everyday activities, much as we have been experiencing lately. The picture to the left shows an American baseball game in progress. The player and the umpire are masked, as are the crowd in the background. The picture to the right shows an attempt to counter the effects of the flu on the day-to-day dealings of the American justice system. It shows a court in session taking place in the open air. It's felt that, much like COVID-19, that fresh air was a safer environment and that being inside buildings was probably more likely to lead to infection. However, this could be taken too far. A Patriot Day, held in the summer of 1918 in Philadelphia and held against medical advice, overruled by the mayor, led to thousands more deaths. Fresh air may well have been safer, but crowds certainly weren't. The photograph to the left of this slide is a staged one, part of a public information campaign showing a man not wearing a mask being refused entry to the tram. That the present government failed to implement such a basic step with regard to COVID-19 perhaps shows that, to paraphrase Marx, The first term as tragedy, the second term as farce is appropriate here. The second photograph was probably as great a help as the masks, as the flu could be transmitted more readily in droplets via spitting, sneezing and coughing. This photograph shows the American Expeditionary Force on the move to transports to Europe, probably taking the flu with them. This brings up the topic of where did it start? Until recently, there were 3 smoking guns, so to speak. The first one, and still unexplained, was that a milder version of flu swept through a British training camp at Tarpley in 1917. The camp was situated close to both a large pig farm and also a farm marketing fowls, especially ducks. Could there have been a species jump for a flu variant? Vera Brittain, the novelist and good friend of Winifred Halkby, was working as a nurse in the camp and caught it along with many others who had to be repatriated back to the UK. It's an interesting theory. Did the flu arrive a year earlier than usually predicted? The second smoking gun was that the Chinese labourers who had been imported into France to assist in the trench building may have brought the disease to Europe from China. This, quite frankly, is a lazy theory. Firstly, and surprisingly in view of recent events, China did not suffer too badly during the 1919 pandemic. So the idea of the flu coming from the mysterious East was simply racist. Secondly, the majority of the Chinese labourers that shipped to Europe came via the USA. So yes, they could have spread the disease, but it's just as likely that anyone come from the USA to Europe at this time was a carrier of the disease. Which leads to the third smoking gun, and by far the most probable. This is that it spread throughout the army training camps in the USA, especially the Midwest, and travelled via there young, virile, strong men marching to war to infect the rest of the world. Enough evidence has now accrued to allow for this theory to be the most likely, that somewhere in the Midwest of the United States, in some way, the flu virus jumped species from its animal reservoir to a human, and then on to the rest of the world. And here's where a good many of those strong young soldiers ended up. Transit camps resembled hospitals. Transit ships often contained up to 50% of the personnel unfit for duty due to flu. The argument can also be made that the advent of the flu created the conditions to allow the Great War to finish quicker. This was due to the fact that the flu virus did not understand the front line and passed backwards and forwards, infecting the German forces who did not have the vast reserves that the Allies had. The Germans were placed at a disadvantage. Why the Spanish flu? Another irony of history. Although flu was racing through the populations of all the belligerent nations of the Great War, all such nations operated strict censorship. As such, it was not reported. Not so in neutral Spain, who reported it widely. Indeed, the King of Spain caught it, and so was headline news. The result is that history has christened the pandemic of 1918-1919 the Spanish flu. Quite unfair, really. King George V caught it. Woodrow Wilson, the US President, caught it. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, caught it. But their illnesses weren't reported. Meanwhile, back in Civvy Street, here's a photo on the left of a local gymnasium being used as a temporary hospital in Philadelphia. Many such buildings were utilised to help the overflowing hospitals. Also, such buildings were used as temporary morgues. The second photo, to the right, is of the digging of mass graves in the same town. It was the worst hit city in the world that we know of. At the beginning of 1918, it had a morgue that could take 36 corpses. By the October, it had 500 bodies laid out in hospital corridors. One of the characteristics of the disease was that the body putrefied quickly. Residents were told to place their dead relatives out on the street for collection. Prisoners were recruited to help dig graves. They eventually were reduced to digging them with a steam shovel. The funeral bell tolling all day long, and the smell of rotting bodies, a vision of hell. Let's look at the pandemic's effect upon Hull. Taken from newspaper reports of the time and mainly from the Hull Daily Mail. The first mention is a quite sly comment disparaging the new flu. However, some 3 days later, a recurrent aspect of the reporting. With an outbreak somewhat closer to home, it was treated more seriously. It still could jibe at the working class and Irish reaction to it. Of course, access to medical treatment at this time was related to your financial means, so perhaps the people on the bottom rung of the ladder may well have felt anxious, a point the reporter failed to see. On the 28th of June 1918, the first death took place from Spanish flu in Hull. The Hull Daily Mail ran a lengthy article headlined, as you can see, Indian seaman's death, followed by policemen's collapse in streets. The first wave of the Spanish flu had struck Hull. What was derived from this article was that the crew were well when they arrived in Hull. Obviously, one or more of them must have been incubating the flu and had probably contracted it in Hull. By the time the seaman died, 27 other members of the crew had contracted it. Seeking the reassurance of experts, the Hull Daily Mail interviewed 2 doctors practicing in Hull. The East Hull doctor apparently saw nothing to worry about, with an average of 100 flu cases per day in June. This cheerful opinion was that a few fine days and it should be cleared away. After this cavalier approach, he then went on to name and shame the ones who brought the flu onto themselves by wearing pneumonia blouses. Also, men working long hours were susceptible. Of course, these people were working long hours in vital war industries, and the chance to stop for a beneficial rest was not vital for either the war effort nor for the family who would receive no income. The day before this alarming news, the Hull Daily Mail's House and Home column advised that if you felt you had the flu, then the best thing to do is to go to bed, have a good hot drink of milk or cocoa, and stay in bed until the rigour of the attack has passed away. This advice was probably more appropriate than the GP's advice already mentioned. Reality began to bite, with the Hull Daily Mail reporting that on the 1st of July, the coroner's court had dealt with 2 deaths, both children. The coroner said, "I'm afraid there is a terrible lot of influenza about." Further disclosures from GPs showed an unseasonable amount of flu cases. The Yorkshire Telegraph reported a request for temporary gravediggers and reported that people are lying dead in their houses 7 days and sometimes 9. The position is very serious indeed. Sheffield actually banned military personnel from cinemas and other places of entertainment because it felt they were transmitters of the flu. It may have started with them, but the flu had moved well past that small group now. In Leicester, it was reported that a woman stopped a GP in the street to tell him she had the flu, collapsed and died at his feet. Stories of motor vehicles and trains coming to a halt, and the drivers of them either being too sick to continue or in some instances being found dead at the controls became common. By the 1st of July, the Chief Medical Officer of Hull, J. Wright Mason, who had been in post since the 1880s and had seen a number of flu epidemics, reprinted a public notice in the local press that had been sent out by the government. At last, some realisation that it wasn't just silly women in low-cut blouses. On the same day as the Chief Medical Officer was sending out the government information, Alderman Francis Askew was being interviewed by the Hull Daily Mail. In what could be seen to be, at best, a "don't panic" message, and at worst, a message from someone who was clearly out of his depth. As the chair of the Hull Corporation Health Committee, he stated that there had been no call upon the committee to take any special action in regard to the influenza prevailing in Hull. The side panel to the right shows what was happening around the country on the same day. Alderman Askew was offering small comfort. That his staff are off sick with it says wonders for his perceptive abilities. And 3 days later, on the 4th of July, the Hull authorities belatedly decided to close all primary schools, yet leave the secondary schools open. 2 days later, 3 bodies were found in one house in Courtney Street. All had died from the flu. And deaths mounted. However, on good authority, quoted the Hull Daily Mail on the 13th of July, flu was abating. It was, but it would be back in the autumn, and that phase would be much worse. The flu killed in 3 ways, either by itself, or by debilitating the patient enough that secondary infections such as bronchitis or pneumonia would kill. Often it wasn't recognised that the flu had allowed the secondary infection to take hold, and death certificates often didn't name the flu as a contributory factor. But looking at the ages of the dead, you can see it was the flu that caused the death. The autumn phase in Hull began in October. Once again, the Hull Daily Mail's London correspondent, on the 10th of that month, tried to see the funny side. In an article headlined, "If doubtful, label it flu," where he wrote of more deaths from it in London, he still posts scorn on it, stating, "There seems no accurate diagnosis of the complaint at present, and as this is the season when minor ills are rife, the flu gets blamed for a great deal more trouble than it is really responsible for." As the graph on the slide shows, the incidence of deaths from flu in Hull during that October could hardly be said to be minor ills. The Chief Medical Officer of Hull issued a statement published in the Hull Daily Mail on the 22nd of that month on the precautions to be taken against the flu. In one telling paragraph, the risk of death was noted. If these precautions are taken, the risk of complications developing may be avoided. If not, pneumonia and bronchitis are apt to occur and endanger the patient's life, especially in the case of adults who continue their occupations whilst in a feverish condition. Well-meaning advice, yes, but in an age when no furlough scheme was in place, it's doubtful how many could follow it. The government's Chief Medical Officer followed up this advice 2 days later by stating quite clearly that he had no way of fighting the pandemic. At present, there are no measures known to stave off these outbreaks of influenza. What can be done is for each member of the community to take steps himself to avoid acting as an agent of extensive spread. He then went on to say, somewhat ridiculously, that people should avoid crowded and badly ventilated places, which for most people would have been their workplaces and their own homes. An unnamed public health authority expert put the blame straight back onto young women again for not protecting their lungs. Yet the talk was of the flu abating. It just started. 3 days later, the 2 articles from the Hull Daily Mail are self-explanatory. What was obvious was that the flu was not abating. This page is taken from the burial record of Western Cemetery from that period, and it highlights that the flu was not abating. Note the ages of the victims of pneumonia. This was and is totally at odds with the norm. and this was just one cemetery in the city. However, even in the midst of the greatest pandemic of modern times, sometimes one can't help but smile. Correspondents to the Hull Mail offered solutions which, probably to their annoyance, the government failed to take up. And of course the citizen had to be on their guard at all times, even whilst buying sweets. Some of you may have noticed during the recent crisis around COVID-19 that some advertisers have used it to promote their products. The same occurred a century ago too. A pandemic doesn't have to be all doom and gloom for everyone, does it? Shades of Donald Trump with regard to Jay's fluid. At least the advertisers weren't advocating internal use. And taking 3 oxos daily might have saved you from flu, but the salt content could well cause heart failure. My favourite advert of the period is the subtle Bovril one. It's very clever. Whilst Vino's, still on sale today, would I doubt offer itself as a cure for flu these days. But let's not just take it, let's fight back. The Hull Daily Mail published this piece in the spring of 1919. Quoting a local sanitary expert, it was suggested that the city of Hull be gassed to eradicate the virus, and he went on to demonstrate his method in a field in Ferriby. His offer wasn't taken up, but the Hull Daily Mail's cartoonist enjoyed himself. Entertainment too was affected. The image on the left is of the National Picture House, now after being bombed in the Second World War. The image on the right is an advert from the same cinema from 1918, stating that the premises were sprayed with disinfectant 3 times daily. The image in the centre is a request from the Chief Medical Officer of Hull, suggesting a 30-minute break between performances, quote, so as to admit of the building being ventilated. With little idea of what they were fighting, the idea of fresh air as a solution was grasped at every opportunity. Of course, the obvious answer, and one could claim that you were only following medical advice, was just to get drunk. But back in reality, in the November 1918, there was some hope that the flu was dying down, and this time it was. By the January of the new year, the figures could be assessed. The true extent of the pandemic on the whole country could only be grasped once the dying had stopped. The article on the left of the slide highlights this extent. For only the second time since 1837, when the registration of births and deaths had been required to be noted, the death rate was higher than the birth rate. In Hull, as the second slide shows, the death rate was the highest since the Russian flu outbreak of 1893. The Ministry of Health issued a leaflet in December 1919. It's chilling reading, especially the part on the second part of the slide. This graph shows on a monthly basis the incidence of deaths from respiratory diseases that were buried in Western Cemetery. Once again, it's quite clear. And just to show how different this period was, this graph shows how the year 1918 was so untypical. So, how many deaths in Hull during this period? In December 1919, Dr. Wright Mason reported that in 1918 there had been 1,988 deaths from flu, bronchitis and pneumonia, of which 975 were flu. 90% were between the ages of 5 and 45. 28% of all deaths from flu were between the ages of 25 and 45. And another 265 deaths in the spring of 1919, and the total deaths from the Spanish flu alone in Hull during this period was 1,240. Of interest, more females died in the autumn outbreak, and in the spring, more males died. Spanish flu didn't care who it killed. So how bad was it? We're living through the COVID-19 experience now. There's rampant and rather hysterical newspaper reporting. The death toll from 4 years of warfare in World War I has been estimated at between 14 to 37 million. The Spanish flu is considered conservatively to have killed about 50 million and possibly as high as 100 million in about 9 months. It is believed that it killed 25 million people in its first 25 weeks. It killed more people than the Black Death, but the population at the time of the Black Death was smaller, so it's arguable which was the deadliest. 10 to 20% of those infected died, and it infected a quarter of the world's population. It spread all around the world in less than a year. In Samoa, there was a death rate of 20%, up to 50%, and the same in northwest Canada. One small island off the Brazilian coast is the only area of population where no deaths are recorded from it. In India, 17 million people died. In Africa, it killed 2% of the population. In the USA, it killed over 600,000 people. It killed more people in its first 24 weeks than AIDS killed in its first 24 years. And it's still out there really, just waiting for its chance to jump species again. And that's why the World Health Organization, which did not exist in 1918, is so good at nipping these outbreaks in the bud. But one day, and these people in this photograph lived through all of that and didn't talk about it. They and your relatives had a brush with the apocalypse and came through it. No wonder they partied throughout the 1920s. I would have done too, and so would you. I'll drink to that. Many of the images used here are from the books Flu, A Social History of Influenza by Tom Quinn, The Great Influenza by John M. Barry, and Flu by Gina Colata. Also, without the use of the Hull Daily Mail's archives, this work would not have been possible. Thank you.